Today we'll be reading Genesis 18, 1 through 8, the Revised Standard Version. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds of milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Next is Matthew 10, 40 to 42. "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." Take these words into our consideration.
Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. Words from the writers of Hebrews. Hospitality is a base practice of Christian and Jewish faith. Welcoming the stranger, welcoming and treating well those who pass by our lives is a base practice of Christian faith. Indeed, later in Matthew's Gospel, in one of my favorite passages, so I have to find an excuse to refer to it as many times as possible. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and gave you clothing? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to these little ones in the names of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Hospitality, welcoming, serving each other's needs, base practices. This passage of Matthew that Phoebe just read comes at the end of Matthew 10, which is itself an entire chapter where Jesus is preparing the apostles to be sent out. Then we move on to another story where we never are actually told that they're actually sent out. But the entire chapter 10 is Jesus preparing them to be sent out. And he's told them what they're supposed to do: tell the story, preach, heal. He's told them, you won't always be welcomed. There will be those who don't like what you say. There will be those who turn their back on you. But, he says, at the end of this discourse, at the end he says, whoever welcomes you welcomes me. Whoever shows hospitality to you is doing something holy. Whatsoever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me, he'll say later. There's something magical, holy, and sacred about being that place that welcomes, being that place that serves. Friend and neighbor, stranger and enemy, who gives even a cup of cold water, or perhaps a little tube of frozen colored sugar water. There's something sacred about being that place where people feel they can come and be welcomed and received. It's a holy thing. And it goes back millennia. In the ancient world, especially in the wilderness areas, hospitality was not just a nice thing to do. It wasn't just friendly to welcome somebody into your tent and give them food and water. It could well be a matter of life and death to welcome somebody into your tent and give them food and water, or to leave the door unlocked as you go out in the middle of the winter, so that if somebody breaks down and your homestead is the only place they can get to as the winds blow and the snow piles high. Hospitality is not just being nice. It sometimes is life-saving. So in the ancient world, it was well understood that hospitality was a base practice. Something you just did. So Abraham is sitting there and sees 3 strangers coming. His first thought, not key point, strangers. He doesn't look down the road and say, oh, look, there's Jim. He looks down there's 3 strangers coming. And now apparently these strangers have a long time to wait, because they get to wait while bread is baked and a calf is slaughtered and butchered and cooked, and these things don't happen quickly. Either that or Abraham had a very, very old precursor to a very powerful microwave. But his first response is to welcome them. Come in. Rest in the road. Wash your feet. Sit for a while. I'll get food. First response is hospitality. First response is to welcome. And yes, the story goes on to that little tale which we heard earlier of Sarah laughing and a baby prophesied. But it starts with hospitality. It starts with welcome. And it leaves open, would the promise come true if Abraham was not ready to welcome? Would the promise have come true if Abraham was not ready to show that he was willing to live in a way that built community? The whole story of Abraham has some very difficult passages. But this is one of those times when Abraham shines. There are times when Abraham is less than heroic, where Abraham doesn't trust the promise. But this is one of the places in his story where he shines. I believe it's one of the stories of faith that the writer of Hebrews had in mind when he wrote that verse about welcoming angels unawares. We too are called to be hospitable. It's been one of the ancient Christian texts. One of the rules of the Benedictine order was if a stranger shows up, you welcome them in. You feed them. You give them a bed. There are stories of multiple versions of this story. I can't remember where I first heard it. Of a monastery which was failing. They were wondering, will we be the last brothers who live in this place? And a stranger came by and said, take heart. Over the next year, Christ will visit you. Now, it would have been nice if there had been a bit more details to that little prediction, like when and how will we know and how should we respond? Well, they knew the answer to the last one. They knew how they should respond. They just weren't sure on the when and the who. So for the next year, whenever somebody walked up to the foregate and knocked on the door, they said, he's here. He's here. And they welcomed the stranger in, and they provided food, and they provided rest. And the next day, the stranger would go on their way. Sometimes it would be somebody who was ill, and so they would take them to the infirmary, and they would nurse them, and the stranger would be healed, and go on their way. And after a year, they found that they hadn't had a bunch of new novices come in. Maybe one or two. But they felt differently. They felt differently. Because while they had been previously been bemoaning their fate and saying, oh, woe is us, they'd had a year of practicing, well, maybe Jesus will be the next one to knock on our door. And it changed their whole way of seeing the world. There's another story, similar, but it ends a little bit differently. Because one of the old monks who had spent all of his life in the order welcoming and greeting and teaching the younger monks that, yes, this is how we greet our strangers. In a moment of candor one day, said to one of them, you know, there are days when I look up and I see somebody walking up to the gate and I say, oh, Jesus, not you again. Hospitality can be a burden sometimes. Hospitality can put us out. Abraham takes a calf. And I'm sure Abraham doesn't have calves to spare. But he sees strangers coming, he says, kill the calf. Prepare it, cook it. We're going to have a feast. We are challenged to continue to practice that hospitality, that welcome, that offering a cup of cold water. We are continued to challenge to give of ourselves, and sometimes it may be uncomfortable. Because hospitality as practiced isn't just about welcoming the people we know. It isn't just about welcoming the people with whom we agree. It isn't just about welcoming the people who are like us. It's about welcoming, period, full stop. It's about welcoming the people who come by the door. The ones who aren't like us. The ones with whom we disagree, sometimes vehemently. The ones who make us uncomfortable. Jesus says, it's not just enough to be nice to your friends, to love your neighbors. Any fool can do that. Any fool can love the people who love you. But I tell you to love your enemies. Loving each other, loving our neighbors as we love ourselves is best shown by how we welcome each other, by how we greet each other. It's not the only way it's shown, of course. There are multiple ways we show love of our neighbor. But one of the best ways is how do we welcome people into our lives, into our midst. Jesus challenges us. Whoever gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, to one of the least important, to one of those ones that just otherwise you could walk past on the street. Whoever gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whatsoever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for many in doing so have welcomed angels unawares. May we live into the challenge of being hospitable people, welcoming people, sharing a cup of cold water, sharing a place to rest, sharing hope, sharing the promise, sharing love.